Welcome to Recovering Cuba's Human Rights Legacy. This is a conversation with Rosa, Leonor, Whitmarsh, Dueñas, Carolina Barrero, and Yoel Suárez. Our moderator is Sebastian Arcos Cazabon. Sebastian has been a human rights activist, a pioneer. He's currently Associate Director of Florida National University's Cuban Research Institute and a member of the Cuban Committee for Human Rights. While in Cuba, he was the Cuban Committee for Human Rights was one of the first independent human rights groups in Cuba under Castroism. Mr. Arcos has been interviewed on radio, television, and print media about Cuban politics and society, and he's also written opinion pieces on Cuba. Sebastian, welcome.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to moderate this event. We have three speakers today. Two of them are very young and are connected to the most recent events inside Cuba, connected to the fight for democracy, and of course with the subject of today's conversation, which is human rights and Cuba's legacy with human rights. We also have Rosa Leonor Whitmarsh, who has a long career of academic and political involvement with this particular topic. We are going to start with Carolina Barrero, one of our younger faces. Carolina is an art historian, he's an activist, he's a human rights advocate for the end of violence and authoritarianism, peace and respect for civil and political rights. She took part in the protest movement that challenged the regime in Havana in 2021 as a member of the 27N movement, and also connected to the San Isidro movement. I think she became very well known in those days, and she was eventually forced into exile in February of 2022. We will hear from Rosa Leonor second, and then last not least, we will hear Yoel Suárez, who is an independent Cuban journalist who has worked with non-state media outlets in Cuba since 2014 and has written extensively about human rights and freedom of religion, of belief. As a result, he and his family have been regularly targeted by the regime. He was forced into exile 3 months ago following years of escalating repression against him and his family. This is something that many of us are very familiar with, kind of behavior that has been used by the government for years. So let's start quickly. Carolina has to go, so we will begin with Carolina. Carolina, welcome. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for the Cuba Free Center for inviting me to be part of this talk. It is a very special day. I'm here in Madrid. We are doing an event for humans for the Human Rights Day. Here behind me, I don't know if you can see it. It says in San Isidro, which is the movie of Catherine Bisquet, that it is presented here tonight. And also another movie by Fernando Fraguela, Mujeres que Sueñan un País, Women That Dream a Country. That's why I will only be able to be at the beginning, and I excuse myself for that, but I wanted to share what is happening here in Madrid with the Cuban community in exile to celebrate this important day. I also want to begin to remark for the ones in Cuba that today are harassed, many like Camila Acosta, Boris González Arena, they cannot leave their houses today because they have a police patrol outside. It is a behavior that the state security performs actually in every day that it is related to freedom of expression or human rights all over the country. So my thoughts with them, and with the more than 1,000 political prisoners that are now political prisoners in Cuba. Cuba has become the country with more political prisoners in the Americas, and possibly the country with more political prisoners per habitant in the world. And so this day, it's a reminder that they are taking the biggest consequences for the cause that we all are fighting for. Human rights and Cuba, it's very linked from its fundamental beginning. It was a Cuban, Guy Pérez Cisneros, the one that introduced the votation on the 10th of December 1948 before the Paris Assembly. He did a wonderful speech before, and then the Declaration of Human Rights was voted and agreed. This is a story that the regime has also, of course, tried to erase, but it should be something that we all should be proud of, and we should be teaching at schools. And I'm sure someday that will happen. The cause of human rights and also of politics, it's something that I think in this moment, especially in the geopolitical moment we are facing, should be rethink, because during the 20th century, human rights was seen as something apart from what was motivating the international relationships and decisions. The thing that was in the center of all of those decisions was pragmatism, political pragmatism, and economical interest. I think that it has been proven that model has failed. And we see it very clearly now. For example, China is the country, the economic power that is competing with the United States. Maybe it is already the economic power of the world. And of course, the human rights inside China, we see that the Chinese government, it massacres the Uyghur minority. It has put its citizens under a complete surveillance system. And also there is only one political party. There is no freedom for civil and political rights. And Russia, we've seen now how Putin has gained so much impunity that actually has dared to invade another country in the margins of the European Union, something that has put Europe under a threat that it has never seen since World War II. So I think it is a moment maybe to rethink that model and to make human rights the center of all political decisions. And maybe if we do that, we will find that economical growth and peace and prosperity will happen, and not the other way around, which I think it has been the doctrine, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you very much. Again, as it happened before, your English is impressive. There is no other way to describe this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will stay some minutes, but then I'll have to leave. I excuse myself for that. And thank you for inviting me again.
Thank you. Thank you.
From Madrid.
Good luck. Good luck in Madrid.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's now give the floor to Dr. Rosa Leonor Whitmarsh. Doctora.
Thank you for inviting me to this forum. Mr. John Suárez, President of the Center for Free Cuba, dear colleagues in this symposium, and dear audience, and our moderator, Mr. Sebastian, Arcos, Cazabon. I am at the end of this rainbow of ages. Carolina, I guess, is the youngest, or he, John, Yoel, I mean, and I at the other end. And as an observer of our history during more than 80 years. Can you believe that? Hardly. But it's true. Since I was a child, I was a good reader of our papers and observer. The thing I wanted to present was a picture, how to say, a frame, a short frame, what happened before this declaration of the human rights that we're celebrating today. And this frame, I would like to tell you these few words. It has taken time. It has taken time to mankind to grumpily accept that it is finally necessary to hardly fighting, to stop hardly fighting by sitting down to get together to reach a common ground. Mankind has always been fighting one against each other. It's so absurd. We're facing now the Ukrainian war. It's out of our minds. Had we accepted the sentence, thou shalt love your neighbor as yourself, it would have been a remedy that we could have done the best possible terms. But we don't love our neighbor as we do to ourselves. And that's the basis of fighting, of not understanding, of lacking comprehension, mercy, clemency, pardon. The awareness has taken a long, has been very slow. If we realize the most important points in which mankind has hurt itself, the greatest invasions of all ages, the Huns in Italy Peninsula, the killing of San Bartholomew, the Holocaust, the Poznan in Poland during the Second World War, now the Ukrainian genocide, everything that has been terrifying, the Holocaust for humanity, we can understand why it's so necessary to have written this Declaration of Human Rights. The two world wars that were waged during the last century, the 20th century, were horrible. Where the First World War showed us that it indicated it was going to be the last war to be waged. It was not true. The conditions in which Germany stayed after the First World War were unacceptable, and that led to a Nazi retaliation, the Second World War. It was a pity, and everything ended with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But reason had to prevail. The next 2 years, as Carolina Barrero has said, were dedicated by Cubans, by two Cubans and non-Cubans, to draft this great Carta, which has a part of a dream, because all cultures, even though they participated in voting to favor it, were unable, have been unable, are unable to please and to reach the purpose of the Carta. But there it is as an indicator of what we should do so to avoid these future wars. The Treaty of Paris, celebrated there in 1947, gave light to this great chart of 30 articles, most of which are violated by the Cuban regime openly. It offers no discussion, as our young people that are witnesses here will prove and will show, because they were witnesses of those harassments. And in that treaty, they tried to counter-arrest the new threat that came out of that was at that time the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union that had been allies of the friends against the Nazis became our worst enemies. And now, even after the dismembering of the Soviet Union, we are facing new threats by that system. We use our brains and our best feelings as human beings to overcome that terrible situation. Unfortunately, our country, Cuba, being so small, it's a big, how to say, a big exhibition of all these sins that our mother society offers to us. It's a shame that we are in this situation. And the way in which Cuba can leave that ground of lack of the mobility it needs to overcome this regime of power is hard to foresee. Anyhow, there are things we cannot touch, that we cannot see, and we don't foresee. But there is something that is the implosion. And the implosion is a phenomenon, as many other supernatural things that happen in a country or to a country, as such as the Soviet Union, which by miracle dismembered so many different cultures, so many different centers of power in a movement that from mostly what we can believe is from one day to another, but it took years to be developed and come out in 1991 to be a new country. I visited those countries right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And even to see the results at that time, 1990, 1981, of what were the communist regimes. However, so many years, so many decades after the fall of the Soviet Empire, we feel that we have not reached the goals of the freedom. Cuba has a legacy. Our Cuban people must know that the legacy of independence history is great. I would say it's like an epopeia, like something that belongs to the most outstanding writers to be written. Cuba has a very honorable history, not only during the past in the 19th century, with all the great thinkers, philosophers, and fighters, but also during the Republic. Our Republic was a positive republic. It's hard to compare with other countries in Latin America, but we can say that the development that Cuba reached before Castro was outstanding, that our laws were pioneers, they were pointers to the rest, not only of America, Latin America, but to the world, and even here in the United States. We are happy to have created the Constitution of 1940, where our talented Cubans got together to build up a constitution made upon the basis of agreement, peace, and understanding that the future of Cuba was based upon reason and law. Our mistakes were natural in a way, and we should not repeat them. But our republic was an example of dedication to create, to advance, to progress in democracy. I happen to live the most outstanding moments of our democracy. They were progressive after the revolution of 1933, with the most modern intentions and ideas. Just if we take that program with all the things they accomplished after the Constitution was written in 1940 and declared, we can have as a model for our future. We don't have to go too far. If we read that, it's not so long. It would take a short time to be read for our youngsters and follow the model. The things that could not be accomplished can be accomplished. Cuba can become again a democracy. And you young people who are with us today can lead that idea, can go ahead with the purpose. Like Mahatma Gandhi, like Martin Luther King, like Elena Medeiros, my dear friend at the Lyceum de La Habana, where I had the pleasure to share with the most talented women we could afford to have. It was a blessing. I belong to that school of Cubans who respected the law, who were interested in social changes, who wanted to the Sierra Maestra in the last minute to give with the fund of the Ciudad Mártires, the martyr city, everything that we were deposited in our hands to be distributed among the peasants. We could not find the bundles because the places were too, the place where it was, they were too large. But there they were. All the Cuban people sent either money or either sweaters and shoes for our peasants. This was a point that was going to be increased, the Reforma Agraria, the agrarian reformation. But, and still it's pending, without any abuse, without any harassment, with all the love that we Cuban people used to have one to each other. And we have to conquer back the confidence and love to one of each other. We have to see each other, like Martí proposed. Martí thought our people were very fine people. That's the same intention we must have one to each other. Trust, confidence, love. Thou shalt love your neighbor as yourself. God bless our people. You young people and the Cuban people are involved in change. So many, most don't know where to go. But our leaders, the pointers, may indicate. The Constitution can be an indicator, can be a point of reference. And also people like Payá, the new generation that follows them, all of you fighters in a very peaceful way and a very, how to say, progressive manner can show so well.
Doctora,
Each.
we're running out of time. Can you please wrap up if you can?
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate Mr. Arcos.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doctora. Let's go next to Yoel Suárez. Yoel, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, first of all, and thank you thank you. I want to thank you as well, the audience that is right now in this, looking at this panel. I love the presentation of that precedes me because the doctor says there are things that you can see and things that you can touch, but are already important. And I think that human rights, it's that kind of thing. You can live in a country without liberty and pretend to be prosperous. You can't live in a country without liberty, without freedom, as Cuba is, and pretend to be, more human. The Cuban regime is threatening Cubans because they know that freedom has the impact, has the possibility to make impact in society and change things. For instance, I want to talk about some issues that I covered as a journalist in Cuba months ago, like a campaign that parents did regards how the right of parents to school to choose how they are gonna educate their children. And this is one of the human rights, it's in the declaration, that is so pushed by the regime because they don't want family educating the children, the new generation. They want state education, educating the new generation. So there was a huge campaign in Cuba against the penal code, the penal code, and as well the family code recently imposed by the regime. And those parents were harassed. Those parents were threatened. But it's very inspiring, and we can talk about the legacy of human rights in civil society, this declaration in civil society specifically, because those parents knew what was the exact article in the declaration that they were defending, and it came also, about the campaign came also about freedom of religion, freedom of consciousness, freedom of expression even. but they know that in the declaration there was a defense for parents to raise their children with their beliefs. And it was so amazing because it's not exactly the most divulgated, the most promoted human right. And I see that as an example as how in civil society, people know that they have rights. And there is this document, which is kind of an ideal, represents kind of an ideal, where they can find written those rights, and they can make that as use that in campaigns, in public discourse. And it's interesting because the regime tries to push that kind of information every time. And I think that other way because this information is getting inside the society is because the progressive penetration, internet penetration. And I think that freedom of expression, freedom to access information, it can lead to a change in Cuba. And we saw that in the uprisings, massive uprisings throughout the island in 11 July, July 11, sorry, and as well July 12, because the voice was spreading because there was a platform, Facebook in this case, social media in general, but there was people who made use of their freedom of expression, and they put the message in the social media and make a contagiously let's gonna help that in that way, make a contagious wave of Cubans going out the streets and telling the totalitarian regime, which is the oldest totalitarian regime in the Western Hemisphere, hey, we don't want the state to rule our lives in every single aspect. We want freedom. People was asking for freedom. And I think that human rights legacy in Cuba, it's impressively well alive in civil society, even when the regime tries to implode that the idea of human rights that are naturally recognized for citizens. And we're talking about, just for finishing my intervention, I wanna put this in the table. We're talking about before this panel how the regimes put focus on bombarding, spreading lies against the human rights movement as a point in Cuba when people told you, hey, you are from the human rights movement, or you are asking for human rights. The people just say, hey, I'm not in that movement. I'm not part of that, because they are afraid, because the regime push fear against society. But I think that with information, we can push back as civil society, as Cubans, as freedom, as people who are interested in freedom for his country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoel. Thank you very much. Let's go into a session of questions and answers. At the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says reactions. When you click on that button, you see a bigger button that says raise hand. Please use that so I can call your question. I think we are a small number. We can manage this without going into a different format. So if you have questions, please go ahead. let me just say a couple of things to put this particular topic in context. The Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights came out in 1948. After that, the Cold War created a double standard or a false dichotomy between political rights and socioeconomic rights. Cuba had a big participation in the creation of that document. But then, of course, after Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, that essentially disappeared from Cuba history. What can be called the modern movement of human rights, especially in totalitarian regimes, appeared in the Soviet Union with Andrei Sakharov, the famous physician and human rights activist, who created the first Human Rights Committee in the Soviet Union in 1970. And in 1974, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1975, the Helsinki Accords essentially created a framework for communist countries to at least attempt to respect human rights. This was used by dissidents in Europe, like Charter 77, to create more human rights movements in those countries that eventually led to the collapse of communism in Europe. Cuba was not behind. The Cuban Committee for Human Rights was founded by a small, romantic, crazy, if you want to call it, group of people in 1976 in Havana. And from then on, the rest is history. Has spread throughout the island. He has become embedded in the opposition. And interesting enough, he has become embedded in the regime's reaction to it. It is easier to claim that you can exterminate a guerrilla movement in the Cambrai Mountains than to exterminate people who are peacefully saying you should respect the universal standard of human rights. Again, questions? I think this is the best way to engage in a conversation. Let me see hands, please. No questions.
I have my hand up. I have a question for Dr. Rosa Leonor Whitmarsh. She mentioned Elena Mederos, and I was wondering for many out there who don't know her role, what her importance is in Cuban history, especially in the ambit of human rights.
Yes. Human rights was...
Who was Elena Mederos?
Elena was a lady born at the beginning of the 19th century, the 20th century. She belonged to a family of independence origin, and was a lady that was mostly a co-founder of the Lyceum in 1929. In 1921, the Cuban women were an advanced group of people with presidents, with the voters' leagues. And Linnea had been a member of the voting league, to get the vote for the Cuban women, which we accomplished, the third country in Latin America. The first one was Ecuador. The second one was Uruguay, and the third one was Cuba in 1933-34. It was one of the things we got during Grau's 126 days of revolution. And Elena belonged to that League of Voters. She being very young. After that, she integrated herself in the Lyceum. She was a founder of social work. Social work means human rights. She was a founder at the University of Havana with Gustavo Gutierrez of the School of Social Work. Elena was being so apparently so languid, so ladylike, she was very, very skilled fighter for human rights. The group of women that created the Liceo were conscious of visiting people at the prisons, women that didn't have a life as we women, the rest of women wanted. They visited the hospitals. Elena visited the children. Elena was a member of the UNICEF before Castro. She was in charge of different countries in Latin America and Africa. Elena was the founder of human rights in Washington with a group of people, such as a bunch of talented Del Castillo, Yoel, Ciro, Jose Antonio Font. Sorry that there were so many wonderful young men and women over Aragon. They were close to her and they fought with her. Elena visited with such a talent and poise the people she knew she had to touch. The same in Cuba. She understood so well the Cuban problem. Even though she belonged to a high class, her basic foundation was very democratic. Elena visited everything she could in Latin America and in Mexico. I mean, I met with her in one occasion. She was extraordinary. With the creation of human rights, many political prisoners came out. She was deeply hurt because she had a family, a relative involved in the prison too, Fernandez Pujals, her cousin, her dearest cousin. And of course, her career, the path that he trod led us to follow her in many aspects. There is a beautiful biography by Barrero, very recommended, where you can see not only the life of Elena, but the whole meaning of the life of Cuban women in Cuba, of course, and is recommendable. Elena is our leader, as well as Ricardo Bofill, as well as Ferrer nowadays, as well as Payá, as well as other people who are in jail right now, Oscar Peña, who died rather recently, and so many excellent followers and thinkers, people who loved Cuba deeply, who knew Cuba, if not physically, morally, because the background of Cuba, the pedigree that our country has is something to be followed in everything. Laws, people. We have lost a part of our identity. That's very dangerous. How to recover that? We educators would love to do something more intensive to rescue that part. It would be part of the present and future task to accomplish that dream.
Thank you, Doctora. Thank you very much. Let's take more questions. Ileana, your hand is raised. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, here we go.
Go ahead.
Rosa Leonor's words about Elena were perfect, excellent. I just want to add that at the age of 80, I remember her, at 80 years old, Elena undertook a trip to England to meet with Amnesty International. And it was because of Elena's work that Amnesty International finally recognized that there were political prisoners in Cuba. She died the next year, but I remember her getting ready, working with Frank and the folks at the center in Washington, working to put that file. And she went to Europe carrying all those files to convince Amnesty International to include Cuban political prisoners in its reports. So we owe that to Elena, because before that, Amnesty International, which is the leading reporter of political prisoners in the world, did not recognize Cuban political prisoners as such. That's just, I wanted to add that. I also wanted to say, going back to what we were talking about, the survey that came out today, published on Cubanet, asking young Cubans, they know what December 10th means, and of course, many of them ask, is it a national holiday? If it isn't a national holiday, I don't know about it. And many of them saying, as Sebastian mentioned, many of them saying, yo no tengo nada que ver con eso, I have nothing to do with that. On the defense, precisely, on the defensive, because the regime has made human rights a crime. Anyway, it occurs to me, and I don't think we have done, I don't think any organization, as many as there are and that have been, have done an education specific project about rights. Cubans do not know what right means. Human, civil, social, economic, they don't know what the concept of right means. And so therefore, maybe we should begin, another thing to fundraise for, God knows, we should start an education specific to young people in particular project on what is a right, what is a citizen's right, so that we can begin to educate Cubans who don't know anything about civil rights or human rights or the history of rights or any such thing, to begin to develop that conscience. Because while there is no education on such a subject matter, people will not be able to change. And the opposition, which is informed and inspired by the whole human rights concept, finds it difficult to win supporters or to win followers. It's difficult enough, but if people don't know what you're talking about when you say human rights, you've lost them to begin with from the get-go. They're lost because they don't know. They don't know what it is, number one, and number two, they do know that the government has designated that criminal behavior. It's just a thought, John. I know we're fundraising for a lot of things of the survival of the center. I know in the past we have sent, for example, coloring books to children through churches about, religious subjects. But I wonder if we couldn't come up with, I'm sure the UN must have, books for children or books for youngsters that perhaps we could get down to Cuba or put them on, electronic, on memories and send them to begin to nurture that knowledge, and that conscience. It's just a thought.
Thank you, Liliana. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's a question from Annalise. Go ahead, Annalise.
First, I just wanted to say thank you to the panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience. And my question is whether they think that the UN Human Rights Council can still play a part in human rights in Cuba, even though the government of Cuba is a member of it. Even though many think that's kind of hypocritical that they're on the Human Rights Council, is there anything that the council can still do that would genuinely be positive?
Yoel, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because as you said, Cuba right now it's part of that council. I think that the Human Rights Council in other moments puts Cuba in a very hard position in the international arena, because they put their finger on Cuba and the human rights violations that occurs in the island. But right now, I think it's very difficult because Cuba is part of the council. In a first in a first way, well, Cuba should never be part of that council, but it is now. And I think that civil society and NGOs, for example, that make political incidents there in the United Nations, they have to raise their voice through those mechanisms in order to put the Cuban issue, the Cuban violations of human rights in the international scenario. I don't know if that answers your question, but my hope is not in the Cuban and Human Rights Council right now, because Cuba is part of it, but in the civil society and NGOs who can put the message there in international arena, because Cuba, the Cuban regime has more fear from how they are pictured as they're out of the island, that how people in Cuba, that what people in Cuba thinks about the regime. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but international pressure, it's very important. I saw that in my own life there in Cuba 3 months ago, that a lot of NGOs put their eye in cases of Indian journalists, or just regular people that are raising their voices against the regime, and the regime has to at least put their I don't know how to say in English. It's a challenge for me making that right now, but they are like take step back in the repression against those people who are in the public international eye in this moment.
Thank you, Yoel. John, you have a long experience with the UN human rights process, first with the Commission, then with the Council. Can you briefly tell us whether or not the Council is an effective way to put pressure on any particular country to respect human rights from your perspective? And I know Janicet has her hand up. I'll go there next. John?
Well, first, and Sebastian, you also have considerable experience as well on this subject, as does Janicet. I do think that one of the examples, and I think it was due to the work of the Cuban Committee for Human Rights, was the success in documenting human rights abuses inside of the island, getting it to the UN Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner, and also lobbying through the UN Human Rights Commission and later the Council to have Cuba condemned at that body for a number of years,
15.
and also with the creation of the Special Rapporteur focused on human rights in Cuba. And this was all while Cuba was a member of the then Commission and later the Council. So it is a battle, it is a struggle. And obviously one of the things we're also doing as an organization is lobbying to have Cuba expelled from the UN Human Rights Council. And once they're out of the council, be it expelled or because they've finished their term, we're also saying they shouldn't be voted back on because it goes against the standards set up for the council. And Cuba has played a role under this dictatorship in undermining international human rights standards together with Russia and the Islamic Conference that have targeted freedom of expression, for example.
Yeah, they have ganged up essentially at the council as they did before in the commission. Janicet, you have a question, go ahead. Your camera is not on. You have to unmute.
Sebastian, thank you. No, my camera is not on. I'm sick. I have COVID, but I'm participating. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you well.
Okay, I just wanted to add to what John said. It's really important to document the cases, the names, the situations of human rights violations in Cuba, and document the cases and send it to these international organizations. Remember that for example, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights of the OAS, since the beginning of the regime, began to document the cases of political prisoners, of tortures, of extrajudicial killings. And Cuba is not part of the commission, which was expelled from the Commission of Human Rights, but all the documentation is there. And it's important to realize that we need to continue doing so, even though Cuba could be part of the council now, or try to stop any anything that we try to do into those places, in those organizations. We need to continue doing so. And I think that the idea Ileana has is important, because we need to, people inside Cuba and also the human rights groups inside the island, the opposition needs to continue documenting the human rights violations in Cuba, because once, in a moment, this could be very useful, and it's been useful in the past to document cases. For example, I remember the Osvaldo Payas case. We needed to go back to all the denounces that were sent to these places in order to say, well, he was killed, he was persecuted, he was repressed, and finally he was killed, to present the case of Osvaldo Payas' death and Harold Cepero. So I think it's very important to see it in that perspective. It's not a political game. Sometimes it's a challenge, as John was saying, but it's very important to continue documenting. It's an invisible task, but it's very much needed in the case of Cuba.
Thank you, Janice. There's a question, Ms. Horowitz, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm continue to be impressed and well, I think just say impressed by how young people have developed such an awareness of civil society. Aliana, I agree that Cubans should not know anything about civil society, but somehow among people like Yoel and Carolina, they have developed a sense of rights. It isn't just, I think, the internet. Because how do they know what to look at on the internet? Where does this come from, Yoel? How do you develop a sense of possibility in a country that is so closed?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think that it's not only internet access that is that is a reason for people in Cuba putting their eyes in human rights, but it's what I say is it's important in the spread of that kind of information. But there is a continuous work inside of Cuba in civil society. Churches are very important in that kind of in spreading the human rights issue, especially regards freedom of consciousness or freedom of religion or freedom of expression in a general sense. And I think that it's a work that a lot of generations of Cubans inside and outside the country are making, and it's part of the cultural knowledge in some groups in society right now. It's because a continuous work through generations. And in my case, in my own case, I received this. I don't know. He's telling us knowledge because my family my family was divided because of the revolution. I had a parent who, a grandparent who was the leader of the patriotic guerrilla in Matanzas, and was killed by the communist regime. I have also a grandparent who was a follower of Fidel Castro. So in that sense, I saw how totalitarian ideas divide families. And my parents, my mother especially, always told me that the family is the first homeland. And if you have that as a kind of important idea in your life, you're gonna protect that, and you are not gonna let an external ideology can implode your family. So in my case, was for that particular experience through life, and because the church, because I'm a Christian as well, as an independent journalist, but I'm a Christian, and because the thoughts, the teaching of evangelism, the story of besides Christianism, and especially in Cuba, where a lot of people who are engaged in Christianism are, pushing against the dictatorship, as Osvaldo Payá, for example, or putting an example, and a lot of people who were shot in La Cabaña, their last words were "Viva Cristo Rey," which is a very, inequivocally a way to say, I respond not to a state, or I respond to my consciousness.
Thank you, Yoel. Any further questions? In the meantime,
I have a question.
yes, Sylvia.
Hi, thank you. Yeah.
Go ahead.
My question is for Yoel, and I don't know if Mario Leonor, who's on the call, might also have some thoughts on this. But my question is, for them as more recent arrivals from Cuba, and they're a bit more aware of what it is like to be part of civil society inside Cuba at this time. What is it that we outside of Cuba, people who want to see human rights in Cuba, want to see a change in Cuba, what are the most important contributions that we could make to support Cubans on the island?
Thank you for that question. I think that the most important contribution, it's not an economical contribution. It is important, obviously, but it's specifically a political contribution. Putting the words of those who are in the island in front of international mechanisms such as OEA or United Nations, or even on other international public spaces like Congress, Congresses, not only in the United States, but also in other countries. I think that putting the eye, giving visibility, I don't know if visibility matched here, but giving visibility to those who are in Cuba, documenting in some cases the human rights violations there, it's a very important contribution. Yes.
Thank you, Yoel. Ileana, you have a question.
Wanted to make a comment that a week or two ago, there's an international NGO that measures the reading of the Bible in countries. And for the first time in 2021, Cuba occupied first place in countries or among countries that are reading the Bible, which to me was a very interesting thing. I am sure this is the result of the work of the evangelical churches, because tradition, well, Protestant churches as well, because traditionally Catholics never read the Bible. Maybe there's been a change in that at some point, but for some reason, I grew up, 19 years of Catholic education, never read the Bible because it was not something that you read, because Protestants read the Bible. But the it's true, but the we have to, that's a profile of our culture. But the evangelical churches, and there are many, especially Central Cuba and East, we owe that to Theo Babun and his incredible effort in the country, have brought the reading of the Bible down to, the block. And it just takes me back to the idea of educating youth about human rights and civil rights and what the concept of rights is all about. If they are reading Bibles, they can read other material as well if we make it available to them. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ileana. John, we are at the 1 hour mark. If you want to continue, I have no problem. Just let me know. Okay. Any further questions that we might have?
I just wanted to remind that we do want to give the speakers, the remaining speakers, a chance to have 5 minutes for their closing statement. But I also wanted to ask you, Sebastian, if you could, because one name that's been coming up, but this is being recorded and it's going to be seen by a larger audience that I suspect are not Cuba experts, but some names that have come up in the course of conversation. One is Osvaldo Dueñas, and it might be interesting if you could just explain who he is and his importance within this context of human rights.
Of course. Osvaldo is a very important figure in the civil human rights movement in Cuba. He founded el Movimiento Cristiano Liberación. Osvaldo was very religious, so the word Christian is in the name of the movement that he founded. He coined a phrase that I believe it's defining in many ways of a period in Cuba, when he said Cubans have the right to human rights. He was trying to counter the government's argument that human rights was a foreign concept invented by the United States to undermine the Cuban Revolution, and everybody who was fighting for human rights in Cuba would, by definition, become an agent of a foreign nation, a mercenary, the usual arguments. It's in a totalitarian context, it is extremely difficult to fight governmental propaganda because they control every single means of communication. They don't do that anymore. They don't control everything. They still control most of it, but they don't control everything. Back then, when Osvaldo was active, they did. So Osvaldo was very smart, very astute in going around that propaganda and countering that propaganda. And I think that was one of the key phrases that he came up with to counter the government's argument and to reach to people. He's, of course, most famously for the Barrero project. He collected thousands of signatures in Cuba twice, because the first time the government stole the signatures. I remember signing the first wave of these documents when I was still in Cuba. So he did it again. And he found a loophole in the 1976 Constitution that allow him to present with a given number of signatures, and propose a reform to the Constitution. So he wanted to reform the 1976 Constitution to include human rights in it. And he essentially forced Fidel Castro to change the Constitution himself. In 1992, Fidel Castro had to move and make changes to the Constitution that eventually evolved into what we Cubans call a candado, a lock, a padlock in the Constitution that prevents anybody from making changes into the constitutions that, according to the language, go contrary to the sovereign decision of the Cuban government to be a socialist republic. That's the language of it. So he forced Castro's hand to change the Constitution. He eventually won the Sakharov European Human Rights Award. He became such an important figure in the opposition in Cuba, the civil opposition in Cuba, that the government came up with the plan to get rid of him, and eventually did so by creating a traffic accident. And the details are still murky. The witnesses, there were 2 foreign witnesses to that event, one Swedish, one Spanish. And what it became clear is that the Cuban government had a hand in creating the accident. And the 2 victims of the accident were, coincidentally, the 2 Cubans that were in the vehicle, Osvaldo and his companion. I must add that Osvaldo's daughter, Rosa Maria Paya, has been very active, and I must say very effective, in reaching out to the European Union, to the United Nations, to the OAA here, and to many Latin American countries, and especially younger people in Latin America and across the United States, with a message that it is time for democracy to go back to Cuba. Osvaldo is a name that will, I think, be enshrined eventually once Cuba is democratic. We will see streets and schools named after him. I have no doubt about that. I hope Ricardo Bofill is also one of those names. I have a special soft spot in my heart for Ricardo. He was a good friend. But those names, Cubans will repeat, hopefully, in the future over and over again, much more than other names that I don't want to mention here because I don't want to contaminate the air. Thank you, John, for the opportunity. More questions, please. I don't see any more hands, John.
I guess we can go to closing statements.
Let's go then to the closing statement. Doctora, Rosa Leonor, your closing statement for today, please.
Bueno,
English.
we have a view from the youngest generation, the point of view, very solid, manifested by John, Yoel, and Carolina. And we had some other, along the years, historical point of view, which of course can be amplified under any circumstance. The fact that the younger people feel positive that the path to follow has to continue. And they feel so fresh, so ready to continue this mission, I would call that, and make us be satisfied. It's a matter of what? It's a matter of, as I said, an implosion before, an implosion. Cannot be foreseen, cannot be prevented, but maybe it can be felt. It's by intuition in some way. It's not a dream. It's the way we can touch reality. Reality has shown us that things move. Nothing stays in the same place, in the same way. Everything, unless the spirit of the man. The spirit of the man along the years, along the centuries, along the millenniums, has proved that even though the human nature is so imperfect, there is a part of our brain that is gifted, that is the one that advances humanity, that advances mankind. We can see that in the political projection of the countries. Let me talk about the Western countries. I'm not acquainted with Eastern countries. Western countries are brand new. What is Germany? A brand new country. The 19th century made all the princes of a coalition form a state. The same with Switzerland. The same one with the Confederation of American States. It was a confederation. It was not a country. It took years. I mean, well, they made the Constitution in 1789, 1787, the American Constitution, but it took time to develop all the laws, all the new enlightenment that had come from the thinkers from England, Hobbes, Locke, and the French ones, Montesquieu. They were also, everything is a chain, and that chain cannot be stopped. Cannot be stopped in any field. Medicine, the flight to space, and the development of the human spirit. We have progressed, even though we have that part of nature that is so wild. Even though we have repeated in the 20th century the barbarian attitudes of countries because of greediness, selfishness, interests, whatever, or the devil we have in ourselves. But anyhow, that we have progress, that we have institutions such as the OTAN, the NATO, such as the OAS, or Organization of American States, such as declarations of human rights, such as the liberation in 1948 was a splendorous year with the independence of India, the independence of Philippines, the Declaration of Human Rights, the creation, foundation of the State of Israel. Everything moves along the millenniums, along the years, and Cuba moves. It's not the same to speak about the colonial times of Saco, Mendive, or our days, or about Father Valera, that we see that what they planted has produced fruit. And it's the same now. In this century, under the last 62 years of a regime that doesn't let you move, there is progress. It moves either over ground or on the ground. But the spirit of man never stops. We know that there are pointers, that there are few who are the leaders, and we trust in them. And in God we trust.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much. Yoel.
Yes, I want to thank you for the invitation. I want to finish my intervention talking about mentioning two names, Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo and Yaimel Romaguera, and Yuri Valles Roca. Yuri Valles Roca and Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo are political prisoners in Cuba. Yuri is an independent journalist, as you know, and Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo is a pastor who was in the streets in July 11th in Santiago de Cuba, the province of Santiago de Cuba. And I want to remember both both names because there are in Cuba more than 1,000 of political prisoners right now, and the center is making efforts, and a lot of other organizations are making efforts to spread the message there in international arena. And I want to thank the center for that, and I want to call for more efforts from other parts of the world, of the free world. Cuba is not an exception in Western culture, it's part of Western culture, and all the ideas of freedom that put their house here in the Western Hemisphere. And I want to thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Joel. Let me thank our three speakers today, Carolina Barrero, Rosa, Leonor, Whitmarsh, and Yoel Suárez. Thank you all for being here, taking your time to listen to this program. Thank you, John, for putting the program together. I pass the ball back to you.
Thank you, Sebastian. And again, thank you all for joining us today. And with this, we conclude this event. Happy International Human Rights Day.
Happy International Human Rights Day. Thank you all.